What if history's most feared weapon wasn't a sword, but a kiss? Behind every crumbling throne and whispered coup was a queen, a mistress, or a widow, turning court gossip into quiet power. They weren't just royal, they were dangerous. From velvet bedrooms to battlefield salons, their lovers shaped empires, and sometimes destroyed them. This isn't about virtue, it's about control. Welcome to the scandal-stained, pearl-draped, rumor-fueled world of royalty's most notorious women. These are the 25 biggest royal nymphs in history, and no, you haven't heard their stories quite like this before. Before we dive in, if scandalous history, fallen crowns, and forbidden love are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe. We do this often, and it only gets darker from here. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? We want to know who's out there listening to royal secrets in the dark. 1. Catherine the Great of Russia. History remembers her in two competing shades, either as the enlightened empress who dragged a feudal empire into modernity, or as the infamous seductress whose boudoir rivaled her battlefield. The truth, as usual, lies tangled somewhere in the silk sheets of political intrigue, French philosophy, and state-sponsored seduction. Catherine the Great ruled Russia for over 3 decades, but the rumors of her lovers have ruled the public imagination for over 2 centuries. Born a minor German princess named Sophie, she arrived in Russia at 14, married off to the awkward, immature Grand Duke Peter, heir to the throne and a man more interested in toy soldiers than in his wife. It didn't take long for Catherine to realize that if she wanted power, she would have to take it, not just from her husband, but from a system that had never intended for her to be anything more than a decorative womb. Her transformation from awkward bride to reigning empress began with books, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Machiavelli. If her husband played war games, Catherine played court games, mastering the language of influence, timing, and flirtation. She wasn't just reading philosophy, she was weaponizing it. And then came the men. Catherine's list of lovers is not simply a tally of private indulgence, it reads more like a political cabinet. Grigory Orlov, the dashing officer who helped her orchestrate a coup against her husband. She rewarded him with titles, lands, and for a time, her affection. Then there was Potemkin, the most enduring name on her romantic ledger, a military genius and perhaps the closest thing she had to a soulmate. Some believe they were secretly married. Others say they were simply kindred tyrants wrapped in furs and strategy. But even after their affair cooled, Potemkin remained her right hand in both war and architecture. He built her an empire. She built him a legend. Catherine's alleged system for selecting lovers became a scandal of European gossip columns. According to whispers, likely embroidered, she had a trusted courtier vet suitors for youth, beauty, and obedience. Some were promoted through the ranks after their service. Others quietly vanished from the court. One allegedly received a mansion and a pension after just 2 weeks. Was it decadence or diplomacy? In Catherine's court, the bed was just another throne, and she knew how to rule from it. But after her death, the stories curdled into outright myth. Enemies of the Russian court and later Victorian moralists spun ever more lurid tales, the most grotesque involving animals, entirely invented to degrade her legacy. The irony, of course, is that no male ruler in Europe was ever slandered for having mistresses. Yet Catherine became a caricature, not a sovereign, but a she-wolf. The real scandal wasn't how many men she took to bed, it was that she took power and never gave it back. Under her reign, Russia expanded its borders, modernized its administration, and briefly flirted with Enlightenment ideals before snapping back into autocracy. She corresponded with Voltaire, reformed education, and even flirted with the idea of abolishing serfdom, before realizing that an empire built on chained labor doesn't loosen its grip easily. She wasn't a saint, but she was never meant to be. Catherine's story isn't just about lust, it's about leveraging perception. Every affair, every courtly flirtation, every silken scandal was a way of asserting her dominance in a world that tried to reduce women to wombs and whispers. Her romantic entanglements weren't distractions from rule, they were often the very engines of it, and while Europe giggled at her bedroom, she redrew its map. But Catherine's appetite, intellectual, romantic, imperial, set a tone that many would echo but few would match. Even centuries later, her name is shorthand for indulgence, her legend swelling far beyond the facts. She wasn't Russia's most promiscuous ruler, she was just the one powerful enough that it scared people. Which brings us, conveniently, to a queen who hid her passions behind poetry and prayer, and whose affairs, unlike Catherine's, weren't shouted from the rooftops, but whispered in salons, scribbled in margins, and murmured behind velvet fans. France's literary sister, royal diplomat, and rumour magnate, Margaret of Navarre. 2. Queen Margaret of Navarre. She was a queen, a poet, a diplomat, and a sister to one of the most powerful kings in Europe. But Queen Margaret of Navarre, Marguerite de Navarre, if you're feeling French and conspiratorial, was also something far trickier. A woman with a mind of her own, a pen sharper than most swords, and, if the rumours are to be believed, a heart that wandered often and not always discreetly. History likes its royal women in neat categories: virginal saints, scheming witches, or tragic wives. Margaret refused all three. She preferred verses to veils, salons to shrines, and lovers, allegedly, to limits. Born in 1492 into the blood-soaked cradle of Renaissance France, she grew up amid the courtly performance of Catholic piety and noble marriage contracts. But Margaret's education wasn't ornamental. She was fluent in multiple languages, conversant in theology, and an intellectual match for any man at court, something that unsettled more than a few of them. Her brother, King Francis I of France, adored her. He called her the only woman who ever understood me, which was either an endearing compliment or a revealing confession. As his closest confidant, Margaret had unusual access to political power, negotiating treaties, smoothing over courtly scandals, and occasionally writing to the Pope with the casual nerve of someone who believed she could edit scripture if needed. But it wasn't just diplomacy that earned Margaret her infamy, it was her pen. Her most famous work, the Heptameron, is a collection of 72 stories modelled after Boccaccio's Decameron. On the surface, it's about pilgrims trapped in a monastery, telling tales to pass the time. But underneath the polite structure lies something far more subversive. The stories pulse with themes of love, betrayal, hidden desire, and sharp commentary on gender and hypocrisy. More than one story ends with a woman outwitting a man or defying the social scripts of marriage and modesty. Naturally, people assumed she was writing from experience. Was Margaret really entangled in a web of lovers, poets, and preachers? Or was her reputation simply the price of being a woman who wrote about sex with clarity and control? That depends on which chronicler you believe. Some name her alleged lovers outright. A courtier here, a scholar there, even a Protestant preacher once, which in Catholic France was about as scandalous as sleeping with a ghost. Others suggest her rumoured liaisons were more emotional than physical. A queen's longing tucked into sonnets and letters, never acted upon, but no less dangerous for it. And therein lies the real power of Margaret's so-called promiscuity. It may have been more literary than literal. Her words seduced Europe in a way that flesh never could. She planted seeds of reform in the French court, flirted with heresy in her writings, and nurtured intellectual circles where women could briefly speak without permission. Still, the rumours stuck. After all, a royal woman who writes about desire is always assumed to be writing confessions. And Margaret, with her veiled allusions and layered narratives, never exactly denied anything. Why would she? Ambiguity was its own kind of armour. Her marriages, first to Charles IV of Alençon, then to King Henry II of Navarre, did little to stifle the gossip. Both husbands were, by most accounts, underwhelming. Neither seems to have occupied the passionate center of Margaret's inner world. She remained, even in marriage, profoundly independent, more loyal to ideas than to vows. And so she lived, between pulpits and poems, chastity and choice. To some, she was the spiritual mother of the French Reformation. To others, the discreet matriarch of courtly libertinism. Both may be true, or neither. What's certain is this: Margaret of Navarre helped shape Renaissance thought while being shaped unfairly by Renaissance rumor. A queen in intellect, if not always in power, she turned her life into a labyrinth, one that generations of historians, biographers, and gossips have tried to untangle. And just when you think you've found the truth, it slips behind another metaphor, another ironic ending, another coy remark penned in the margins of a manuscript, passed hand to hand, lover to lover, queen to confidant. Which brings us, quite naturally, to a woman who didn't need metaphors. Her passions were as public as her rise to power, and her romances were not whispered behind fans, but boldly paraded through the revolutionary salons of Paris. She wasn't born an empress, but she certainly slept her way into becoming one. Empress Josephine de Beauharnais is waiting. 2 scandals in, and we've barely scratched the surface. If you're already hooked, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next royal twist. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you binging royal chaos at sunrise in Sydney or falling down a historical rabbit hole at midnight in Chicago? We see you. 3. Empress Josephine de Beauharnais. She began as Rose Tachet de la Pagerie, a name too soft for the violence that would shape her. Born into a crumbling French colonial family in Martinique, she was not destined for an empire. Her early life was an uneasy dance between privilege and precarity, sugar plantations, enslaved labor, the scent of molasses and decay hanging in the air. The world that raised Josephine was one built on contradictions, refined cruelty, perfumed survival, and she learned quickly that the most dangerous game was pretending not to play one. By the time she reached Paris, she had mastered that art. She was charming, perceptive, and calculating in the way only a woman surrounded by predators could be. Her first marriage, to Alexandre de Beauharnais, a viscount with impeccable manners and a wandering heart, brought her into the French aristocracy and into the eye of the storm that was the Revolution. Alexandre would lose his head to the guillotine. Josephine would nearly follow. Only a bureaucratic error spared her from execution. It's hard to say whether she survived by chance or by instinct, but from that moment forward, Josephine lived as though she owed death a debt and intended to collect interest through pleasure, power, and reinvention. Paris, after the Terror, was a fever dream. Powdered wigs and powdered noses, salons full of survivors pretending they hadn't screamed yesterday. The aristocracy was decapitated but not dead. It simply grew new faces, younger, more daring, less tethered to morality, and in that glittering chaos, Josephine rose. She became known as La Belle Créole, the island enchantress whose eyes promised sympathy and whose silence promised secrets. She had lovers in abundance, but what set her apart was her diplomacy. Every affection was a negotiation, every affair a treaty. Her circle included generals, financiers, poets, and politicians. Some whispered she was a courtesan, others called her a witch of charm. Both were right in their own way. Josephine understood the social economy of post-revolutionary France better than any statesman. Intimacy was currency, and she traded it well. Her liaisons weren't careless, they were investments. Each brought her closer to the center of influence, until one, an unremarkable Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, changed her fate entirely. Napoleon fell in love with her the way revolutionaries fall for power, completely, obsessively, irrationally. He was younger, awkward, and emotionally volcanic. Josephine, ever the survivor, recognized both his potential and his volatility. When they married in 1796, she was already navigating between admiration and strategy. The early letters he sent her bordered on operatic devotion. Hers, by contrast, were restrained, even hesitant. She loved him, perhaps, but cautiously, like someone touching a live wire just to feel the spark. As Napoleon's star ascended, so did hers. Yet the empire, built on military discipline, was ruled at home by a woman whose influence flowed through charm and rumor. She presided over the imperial court like a benevolent sorceress, warm, ethereal, quietly dangerous. Her salons were filled with gossip, politics, and perfume, three forces that could bring down governments if mixed properly. Her reputation for lovers persisted, of course. Generals, courtiers, ambassadors, names that flitted in and out of pamphlets and whispers. But it's unclear how much was true and how much was projection. To a patriarchal empire, a woman with autonomy is always presumed to be ruled by appetite. What is certain is that Josephine was adored, envied, and feared in equal measure. She cultivated an aura of romantic melancholy, a survivor of the revolution, a victim of love, a woman too tender for the brutal men who ruled her world. It worked. When Napoleon divorced her in 1810, it wasn't for lack of affection, but for lack of an heir. His new empress was fertile. Josephine was immortal. Even in exile, he wrote of her with longing. He conquered Europe, but never quite conquered her. Her story lingers as a portrait of paradox, sensuality as survival, tenderness as manipulation, love as a form of politics. The myth of Josephine is not about promiscuity, it's about adaptation. She learned to turn desire into strategy, tragedy into charisma, and ruin into relevance. Every affair, every alliance, every softly spoken promise was a way of rewriting the script of a woman's worth in a world that valued them for silence. When she died at Malmaison, surrounded by relics of her past, her name had already become shorthand for the seductive chaos of post-revolutionary France. To her admirers, she was grace personified. To her detractors, she was proof that charm could overthrow reason. And to history, she remained a riddle, the empress who mastered the art of making love to power without ever surrendering to it. And from that riddle, we turn to another sovereign who refused to play by the script, one who abdicated her throne rather than her freedom, whose passions were philosophical, political, and sometimes painfully human. Where Josephine loved men of ambition, the next woman loved the idea of escape. Her name was Christina of Sweden. 4. Queen Christina of Sweden. By the time she was 6 years old, Christina of Sweden was already being called a king, not figuratively, literally. When her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, died on the battlefield, the crown passed to her small, curious head with the official title King of Sweden rather than Queen. The court spun it as symbolic strength, a clever gesture for continuity. But Christina never forgot the weight of that word, king, and how unnatural it felt sitting atop a body expected to bear children, not policy. Born in 1626 and raised among warriors and theologians in the icy halls of Stockholm, Christina was a walking contradiction from the start. She spoke Latin before she was 10, adored Descartes, hated corsets, and preferred philosophy to embroidery. While other girls were taught to curtsy, she was reading Seneca and sparring with the nobility. And even in her youth, the whispers began. She dressed like a man, sometimes. She walked like one, talked like one, carried herself with a confidence that was either regal or inappropriate, depending on the observer's level of discomfort. She refused marriage outright, often declaring that she had no intention of becoming a breeding machine. Her courtiers laughed nervously. The foreign dignitaries frowned, but she didn't care. Christina ruled on her terms, and those terms were deeply inconvenient for anyone invested in gender roles or dynastic clarity. As she matured, the scandal grew. It wasn't just her refusal to marry, it was who she was rumored to love. Letters, now preserved in archives, suggest intense emotional relationships with both men and women, but especially with one lady-in-waiting, Ebba Spa. Christina called her Belle and wrote letters so effusive, so drenched in private longing, that historians have spent centuries trying to decide whether they were passionate friendships, romantic affairs, or coded political alliances. Perhaps they were all three. With Christina, the boundaries between categories rarely held. That same ambiguity defined her rule. She funded the arts, imported philosophers, and turned her court into an intellectual salon. But she also alienated her advisors, ignored protocol, and found governing a tedious burden. Christina wasn't interested in ruling so much as she was in questioning morality, religion, power, and eventually that questioning led her to the most dramatic decision of her life. In 1654, at the age of 28, Christina abdicated the throne. The official reason? Exhaustion. The real reason? Nobody really knows. Some say it was religious. She had long been drawn to Catholicism, a dangerous curiosity in Protestant Sweden. Others say it was personal, an escape from the unbearable pressures of marriage, motherhood, and monarchy. Or maybe she was just bored. Some people start wars for glory. Christina started a life in exile for peace of mind. She left Sweden in secret, disguised as a man, her identity hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a traveller's cloak. She rode to freedom like a knight from a story she never believed in. By the time she arrived in Rome, she had converted to Catholicism, shed her royal titles, and reinvented herself as a patron of the arts and mischief. Popes and cardinals adored her. Courtesans and scholars circled her like moths around a scandalous candle. And yet, the rumours never stopped. Her salons were whispered to be dens of seduction. Her gender presentation remained fluid, her sexuality an eternal question mark to biographers. Christina herself refused definition. "I am neither man nor woman," she once wrote. "I am simply Christina." She died in 1689, buried with honours in the Vatican, one of the only women interred there. A Protestant-born, Catholic-buried ex-queen who abandoned power, avoided marriage, and collected affection the way others collected paintings. Her life was a refusal wrapped in royal silk, a long, sustained no to everything she was supposed to be. And if Christina was a refusal made flesh, the woman who follows her was something far more dangerous, a symbol, a scapegoat, a queen who never stood a chance, vilified not for who she was, but for what she represented. As revolution devoured the old world, she became the face of excess. Whether guilty or innocent, Marie Antoinette could never escape the mob's imagination. 5. Marie Antoinette of France. Long before she ever said, "Let them eat cake," which, by the way, she absolutely didn't, Marie Antoinette had already been devoured by public fantasy. She arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, a political offering in silk slippers, married off to the future Louis XVI in a union designed more to pacify European tensions than to build a functioning marriage. She spoke little French, wore too much blush, and had no idea that her face would one day become the mask of a dying regime. From the start, the French court didn't quite know what to do with her. Neither did her husband. Louis was awkward, introverted, and far more interested in locks and clocks than in consummation. For years, the royal marriage remained just that, a title without substance, and in the cavernous halls of Versailles, where gossip was a sport and subtlety a myth, this delay was interpreted as a personal failure. Of course, being a foreign teenager in a hostile court was not enough. Marie Antoinette was also expected to produce airs on schedule and smile while doing it. So she adapted. She turned to pleasure not as excess, but as distraction. The theatre, the masquerades, the infamous Petit Trianon, where she could dress like a shepherdess and pretend for a moment that she wasn't trapped in the gilded machinery of history. It was a fantasy, yes, but it was also a refuge, and it didn't take long for the fantasy to be twisted into something more dangerous. Pamphlets began to circulate, libelles, illustrated leaflets portraying her as a libertine, an adulteress, a foreign snake in the French garden. They accused her of affairs with everyone from courtiers to soldiers to her closest female friends. Some claimed her children weren't Louis's. Others insisted she was bankrupting the nation to fund her decadent lifestyle. The truth, as usual, was irrelevant. She became a symbol of indulgence during a time when France was boiling with hunger. The most persistent of these rumoured affairs involved Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman who seemed to drift through Marie Antoinette's life like a tragic novel waiting to be written. He was gallant, politically savvy, and dangerously devoted. The letters they exchanged, many of which survive, some redacted with suspicious ink blotting, hint at deep affection, possibly more. Whether or not they were lovers in the traditional sense is unclear, and perhaps beside the point. What mattered was the perception, and perception was Marie Antoinette's most relentless enemy. Her supposed nymphomania became a weapon of the revolution. If she had too many dresses, it was decadence. If she had too many friends, it was conspiracy. And if she had too many lovers, imagined or not, it was treason. In a society that demanded purity from its queens while rewarding predation in its kings, Marie Antoinette became the ultimate scapegoat. A foreign woman with power, blamed for the sins of an entire collapsing system. By the time the guillotine came for her, she was already a myth. Her real sins, naivety perhaps, or misjudged loyalties had long since been buried under the avalanche of accusation. The woman who once delighted in powdered wigs and private gardens was marched through jeering crowds, her hair shorn, her dignity intact. History has since tried to resurrect her image. Some call her misunderstood, others a victim, but maybe she was just human, flawed, cornered, and trying to find light in a palace designed to blind. If Marie Antoinette was the sacrificial lamb of courtly scandal, the next woman was something far more serpentine, a creature of myth and manipulation whose name still slithers through Renaissance nightmares. Blamed for poisons, affairs, and everything in between, she was a daughter, a duchess, and according to centuries of slander, a devourer of men. Enter Lucrezia Borgia. 6. Lucrezia Borgia. Few names in history have been so lavishly embroidered with sin as Lucrezia Borgia's. To say her reputation precedes her is an understatement. It slithers ahead like a jeweled serpent, whispering of poisons slipped into goblets, incestuous intrigues behind velvet curtains, and noblemen lured into doom by her golden hair and angelic face. Whether she was a villain, a victim, or merely a vessel for other people's ambitions, the myth of Lucrezia has outlived every one of her accusers. Born in 1480 into the infamously ambitious house of Borgia, Lucrezia was the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. That alone should give you a sense of the climate she was raised in. The Borgias were not known for subtlety. Power was their religion, politics their bloodstream, and for Lucrezia, beauty was both a blessing and a pre-written curse. From her earliest years, she was a political pawn. Her marriages, 3 in total, were not unions of love but transactions, alliances forged in bridal gowns. At 13, she was married off to Giovanni Sforza, a nobleman useful to the family's territorial ambitions. When he ceased to be useful, he was discarded. The annulment was public, humiliating, and justified with rumours that he was impotent, an accusation that provoked his famous revenge, claiming that Lucrezia was involved in an incestuous affair with her father and brother Cesare. The scandal exploded across Europe. Whether or not there was a grain of truth behind it didn't matter. The story was too perfect, too perverse, too Borgia. The irony, of course, is that Lucrezia's alleged promiscuity was almost entirely constructed by men trying to deflect their own failures. Her father and brother wielded her like a blade, marrying her off when it suited them, dragging her back when it didn't. Between political shifts and papal power plays, Lucrezia became a professional bride, her body the dotted line on treaties, and yet, in each new court, she adapted, she charmed, she survived. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was supposedly one of her great loves. Naturally, he ended up assassinated under mysterious circumstances. Cesare was widely blamed. Lucrezia, once again, was accused of complicity. even though no evidence ever proved her involvement. She wept, she withdrew, she remarried. But it was in her final marriage to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, that Lucrezia found something close to agency. In Ferrara, far from the Roman vortex of Borgia politics, she emerged not as a femme fatale, but as a serious duchess. She sponsored poets, philosophers, artists. She governed during her husband's absences. She raised children. She became, by many contemporary accounts, deeply religious, charitable, and even beloved. But by then, it was too late. Her reputation had calcified into legend. Why did the myth stick so well? Perhaps because it served so many agendas. Enemies of the Borgia family needed a scandal to justify their outrage. Moralists needed a cautionary tale, and Renaissance Europe, so often ruled by lecherous men, needed somewhere to deposit its own guilt. A beautiful woman with too much influence made an ideal target. Lucrezia didn't poison people, but her story has been poisoned for centuries. Still, the rumors endure, not because they're true, but because they reflect something deeper. Our need to believe that beauty must conceal danger, that power in the hands of a woman must be unnatural, and that influence earned through charm must always be suspect. She died at just 39, exhausted from childbirth and perhaps from a life spent navigating a web of lies spun by others. The real Lucrezia remains elusive, quiet, composed, elegant, and misunderstood. Her scandal wasn't in what she did, but in what men did in her name. And if Lucrezia was the victim of a story too good to fact-check, the next queen wore her scandal like a crown, boldly, rebelliously, and without apology. Her bed became her battlefield, and her children became question marks. Welcome to the unruly reign of Queen Isabella II of Spain. 7. Queen Isabella II of Spain. If Lucrezia Borgia was damned by myth, Queen Isabella II of Spain was scandal incarnate, in the flesh, on the throne, and in the gossip pages of Europe for nearly half a century. Unlike so many queens who suffered from fabricated whispers, Isabella's reputation for romantic entanglements wasn't just court rumor. It was a matter of public dysfunction, constitutional crisis, and eventually exile. Born in 1830 into a nation already buckling under the weight of dynastic disputes, Isabella was declared queen at the tender age of 3, thanks to her father's death and a controversial decree that bypassed traditional Salic law. Her right to rule was immediately challenged, sparking the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict that essentially asked the question, should Spain be ruled by a girl? By the time she was a teenager, Isabella had become more figurehead than sovereign. Surrounded by ministers, generals, and opportunists, her life was steered by the ambitions of others. In 1846, at just 16, she was married to her double first cousin, Francisco de Assis de Bourbon. On paper, it was a political alliance meant to stabilize the crown. In practice, it was a disaster from the opening vows. Francisco was famously delicate, religious, and, according to persistent rumors, wholly uninterested in women. Whether those rumors were true or cruel exaggerations is impossible to say, but what is clear is that Isabella did not find him companionable. She is said to have wept bitterly on her wedding night and treated her marriage as a formality from then on. What followed was a series of increasingly bold romantic liaisons that became the worst-kept secret in Spanish politics. Military officers, aristocrats, singers, politicians, her alleged lovers were a rotating cast of powerful, ambitious, and often dangerously charming men. Some served brief terms in her heart. Others, reportedly, wielded long-term influence behind the scenes. The press and her political enemies ate it up. A queen in bed with the army was scandalous enough. A queen who might be raising children by them, scandalous and politically radioactive. Indeed, of Isabella's 12 pregnancies, many historians have questioned the paternity of nearly all her children. One supposed lover, General Enrique Puigmolto, was so often referenced as a likely father of one of her sons that Puigmolto became a satirical shorthand for royal illegitimacy in Spanish cafes. Her court was nicknamed the Queen's Seraglio, and European newspapers printed biting caricatures of a monarch who seemed to treat the crown like a side hustle between romances. But behind the ribald jokes and whispered names was a country in crisis. Isabella's reign was plagued by instability, military coups, shifting alliances, corruption, and the collapse of liberal hopes in favor of authoritarian retrenchment. Her personal scandals became a stand-in for the larger failures of her regime. It wasn't just her lovers that made people angry, it was what they symbolized: royal arrogance, decadence, and detachment from the grinding poverty and disillusionment on the streets. In 1868, the Glorious Revolution forced Isabella into exile. She fled to France with her reputation in tatters and her crown in a box. Unlike other monarchs who went quietly into retirement, she remained a polarizing figure for decades. Even after formally abdicating in favor of her son, she lingered in the background of Spanish politics, her name still synonymous with the decay of Bourbon authority. And yet, she never apologized, never publicly regretted. In exile, she lived comfortably, surrounded by loyalists and reminders of the life she'd lost, but never subdued by it. Her lovers faded with time, but her refusal to conform remained her final defiance. A queen who loved too much, ruled too poorly, and lived too loudly. But while Isabella's scandals erupted in the spotlight, the next young bride barely had time to learn her role before whispers of past and present lovers became her undoing. A Tudor queen with a fatal knack for charm and for being in the wrong place, in the wrong king's bed, at the wrong time. Enter Catherine Howard. 8. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was barely out of girlhood when she was plucked from obscurity and hurled into the most dangerous role in England, the wife of King Henry VIII. She was young, vibrant, charming, and disastrously unprepared, and like a candle left too close to a drafty window, she burned quickly, flaring briefly, casting shadows across the Tudor court, before being snuffed out in scandal. Born around 1521 into the powerful but perennially cash-strapped Howard family, Catherine was raised in a chaotic household overseen by her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Her early education, such as it was, occurred in a dormitory-like setting filled with other noble girls, minimal supervision, and more hormones than decorum. It was not the polished upbringing of a future queen. It was a breeding ground for bad decisions, blurry reputations, and ill-fated flirtations. By her early teens, Catherine was already entangled in a pair of youthful romances. One was with her music tutor, Henry Manox, and the other with Francis Derham, a secretary who may have thought himself her fiancé. These were not courtly love affairs conducted behind fans and tapestries. They were clumsy, adolescent, and crucially carried out in a house where gossip echoed louder than church bells. While most girls might have carried such experiences into adulthood as private lessons in heartbreak or regret, Catherine's past would become public evidence in the most humiliating trial of her short life. Her ascent began not because of politics or power, but because of timing. By 1540, King Henry VIII was 50, gout-ridden, and increasingly irritable. His fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, had failed almost immediately. It lacked chemistry, affection, and more to the point, an heir. When Henry first laid eyes on the teenage Catherine Howard, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Anne, he was reportedly smitten. She was the anti-Anne, vivacious, flirtatious, warm. She didn't speak German, she smiled. They married within months of Henry's annulment. Catherine became queen at roughly 17. Henry, more than 30 years her senior, was enchanted for a while. He showered her with jewels, praised her youth, and paraded her as a symbol of revived virility. To the court, it looked like a fairy tale revival, but beneath the surface, the old stories, Catherine's past lingered like a storm cloud. Whispers began to circulate that the Queen's history was less than spotless. When confronted, she first denied, then admitted, then tried to explain. The lines between her youthful indiscretions and present conduct blurred rapidly, and worse, accusations surfaced that she had begun a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Chamber, during her marriage. Whether it was emotional, physical, or just foolishly secretive, the fallout was catastrophic. Political enemies pounced. Religious reformers, bitter nobles, and rival families used the scandal like a dagger. Suddenly, Catherine wasn't just a girl with a past, she was a threat to national security, a stain on the crown, an unfit queen in a dangerously fragile kingdom. The king, once besotted, was shattered. Reports say Henry wept, raged, and fell into a deep melancholy. He had given his heart to Catherine, and she had not returned it in kind, or so he believed. In the end, it didn't matter whether she loved him. It only mattered that she had disappointed him. And kings, especially insecure, aging ones, don't take kindly to disappointment. Catherine was stripped of her title, imprisoned, and subjected to intense investigation. Former lovers were tortured, confessions extracted, alliances shattered. In a final indignity, her execution was scheduled barely a year and a half after her wedding. She was said to have asked for the execution block in her cell the night before her death, so she could practice laying her head upon it. Not for drama, perhaps, but for dignity. The final performance of a girl who had lived too fast, too brightly, and too close to a king's fragile pride. Her downfall wasn't about sin. It was about timing, power, and a world that punished women for knowing desire, but praised men for indulging it. Catherine Howard became a cautionary tale, not because she was wicked, but because she was young, and because kings never faced the sword. But if Catherine was punished for indiscretion, the next woman made indiscretion her formal occupation. Not a queen, but treated like one. Not a wife, but more powerful than many who wore the crown. Her beauty became policy, her influence unmatched. Meet Diane de Poitiers, the official mistress of a king and the true queen of the French court. 9. Diane de Poitiers. To understand the strange gravitational pull Diane de Poitiers exerted on 16th century France, you have to first understand what she was not. She was not a queen, not a princess, not particularly young by the time history noticed her, but somehow she managed to become the central axis around which power, beauty, and monarchy spun. For over 2 decades, Diane was the undisputed mistress of King Henry II of France, his confidant, political advisor, and muse. In a court obsessed with hierarchy, she broke rank. In a world obsessed with youth, she defied age. And in an era that saw women as ornamental, she became an institution. Born in 1499 into a noble family, Diane was orphaned early and married off at 15 to Louis de Brezé, a man nearly 40 years her senior. It was a political match, not a romantic one, but Diane played her role with grace and calculation. When her husband died, she didn't retreat into mourning as the times demanded. Instead, she dressed in black and white for the rest of her life, mourning colors that became her trademark. She turned widowhood into a brand, but it wasn't until the next generation that she would step into the center of royal power. Enter Prince Henry, the second son of King Francis I. Diane first encountered Henry when he was a boy of 7, shy, awkward, and recently returned from a traumatic hostage stint in Spain. She was appointed his governess of sorts, a maternal figure in the political sense. But as he grew older, so did the nature of their bond. By the time Henry was 16 and Diane 35, they were lovers, allegedly. That word, allegedly, follows Diane like a perfume trail through the corridors of history. Whether their relationship began as mentorship, seduction, or mutual obsession, it was undeniable that by the time Henry took the throne in 1547, Diane de Poitiers was not just beside him. She was behind him, above him, and often ahead of him. She held court as a semi-regal figure, signing royal documents, issuing patronage, and managing the king's image. Her apartments in the palace were grander than the Queen's. Her symbol, the crescent moon, adorned royal architecture. Her name was whispered in diplomatic meetings, envied in salons, and etched into the very stone of Renaissance France. And yes, she had lovers before Henry. She had lived, after all, but none matched the historical weight of their bond. In many ways, she was more of a partner than a mistress. The court didn't know how to handle it. On paper, Queen Catherine de' Medici was the king's wife. In practice, Diane was the one calling the shots. Catherine despised her quietly for years, forced to smile while Diane orchestrated events, influenced policies, and was lavished with jewels, titles, and lands. It wasn't just a personal rivalry, it was a political imbalance, a reminder that love often outranked law. Diane, for her part, managed this precarious position with the finesse of a veteran chess player. She remained publicly deferential, always insisting on her loyalty to the king and the crown. But privately, she was one of the most powerful women in Europe. She didn't just sleep with the king, she shaped his reign. And yet time, that silent executioner, came for her influence. When Henry died in a jousting accident in 1559, struck in the eye by a splintered lance during a tournament Diane had reportedly advised against, Catherine finally seized her moment. The new widow wasted no time. Diane was banished from court, stripped of her properties, and forced into retirement. The woman who had once ruled behind the throne was reduced to a cautionary tale about the volatility of royal favour. But Diane didn't disappear in disgrace. She retreated with dignity, maintaining her household, managing her finances, and continuing to be revered by artists and poets who had long made her their subject. She lived until 1566, outliving both Henry and Catherine, and even in old age was said to retain a sharp mind, a regal bearing, and the same moonlit mystique that had once held a kingdom spellbound. Diane de Poitiers wasn't just a royal mistress, she was a reminder that power comes in many forms. Sometimes it wears a crown, sometimes it wears pearls and black silk and stands just behind the throne, whispering where the real decisions are made. But if Diane played the game with elegance, the next woman played with empires. Her lovers were not merely companions, but generals, conquerors, and symbols of collapsing worlds. A queen of Egypt, a master of image, and the eternal femme fatale, Cleopatra VII awaits. 10. Cleopatra son of Egypt. Cleopatra VII was the last pharaoh of Egypt, but she ruled less like a relic of the past and more like a preview of modern celebrity. To the Romans, she was the siren of the Nile, a woman whose lovers always seemed to end up dead or dethroned. To the Egyptians, she was a goddess made flesh, the living embodiment of Isis. And to later historians, she became a riddle wrapped in eyeliner, floating down the Nile in a barge made of myth, scandal, and geopolitical anxiety. Born in 69 BCE into the decadent, crumbling Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra inherited a family tree that doubled as a crime scene. The Ptolemies had been marrying their siblings, backstabbing their cousins, and poisoning their dinners for generations. It was less a royal lineage than a long-running melodrama, and Cleopatra was born into its final, most operatic chapter. By the time she took the throne, co-ruling first with her father, then with her brother-husband, yes, both, Egypt was no longer the mighty empire it had once been. Rome was ascendant, and the Nile, for all its ancient majesty, was rapidly becoming a tributary of Roman ambition. Cleopatra knew this. She also knew that to survive as a woman in a world ruled by men with swords and senates, charm alone would never be enough. So she did what many male rulers had done before her. She turned alliances into intimacy, and intimacy into survival. Her first infamous entanglement was with Julius Caesar, a man who had already rewritten the rules of the Roman Republic by the time she rolled herself into a carpet and appeared before him in Alexandria, a scene so theatrical that it still sparks arguments among scholars, filmmakers, and costume designers. Cleopatra was just 21, Caesar nearly 52, but the age difference was the least of what scandalized Rome. Their relationship was political theater with real-world consequences. Cleopatra needed Roman backing to reclaim her throne from her feckless brother. Caesar needed a foothold in Egypt to control Rome's grain supply. What they shared was mutual benefit, and perhaps more. She bore him a son, Caesarion, who was paraded through Alexandria as the heir of two worlds. Back in Rome, Caesar was assassinated, leaving Cleopatra to retreat to Egypt with a child and an empire half won. Enter Mark Antony. If Caesar was power incarnate, Antony was its reckless cousin, the soldier-statesman with a taste for wine, war, and women. Cleopatra offered him all three, but with strategy behind the seduction. Their affair ignited not only gossip, but war. Unlike her liaison with Caesar, Cleopatra's relationship with Antony became public, theatrical, and defiantly political. They held court together in Alexandria, styled themselves as gods, and presented a united front against Octavian, Caesar's heir and the future Augustus. Rome was scandalized, not just by the sex, though that predictably got top billing in the pamphlets, but by the optics. Roman general dressing like a Greek, living with a foreign queen, handing out eastern territories like party favors. Octavian seized on the narrative, painting Cleopatra as a corrupting force, a temptress pulling Roman virtue down into the sand. The war that followed, culminating in the Battle of Actium, was more than a clash of armies. It was a referendum on who would rule the future, a Latin-speaking empire of austere masculinity or a Hellenistic holdout where power could be shared between gods and queens. Cleopatra lost. History, written by the victors, reduced her to a villainess, a seductress, a warning. But that version does her no justice. Cleopatra was a polyglot, a scholar, a naval commander, and a political chess master. She used her relationships not to escape responsibility, but to shape it. She understood that love could be a weapon, just like war, and unlike her Roman counterparts, she knew that image was often more powerful than fact. Her story remains magnetic, not because she was licentious, but because she refused to be small, because she loved dangerous men and made them more dangerous, because she dared to rule with softness and steel, draped in myth and reason, at a time when women were expected to disappear behind veils and dynasties. And if Cleopatra ruled with charisma and died in legend, the next queen paid the ultimate price for charisma without control. She rose fast, flirted freely, and fell hard under the weight of court politics. Her enemies called her unfaithful. Her king called for her death. Her name was Anne Boleyn. 11. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn entered history sideways, first as a minor lady-in-waiting, then as the woman who upended England's religious structure, married its most dangerous king, and ended her life in the most public humiliation the Tudor court could invent. To some, she was a seductress who bewitched Henry VIII into abandoning his queen and the Pope. To others, she was a reformist, an ambitious woman who wielded intelligence and wit like a blade. But to the men who eventually destroyed her, she was just inconvenient, too clever, too proud, and, most unforgivably, no longer useful. Born around 1501 into the upwardly mobile Boleyn family, Anne was educated in the courts of the Netherlands and France. These were not finishing schools, they were political arenas in silk. There, Anne absorbed languages, fashion, and the art of flirtation not as frivolous pursuits, but as currency. When she returned to England, she was fluent in the courtly arts and fluent in the subtext that ruled them. At court, Anne served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. She was not considered a great beauty. Her appeal lay elsewhere. Sharp conversation, confidence, calculated glances. She knew how to stand out, and more importantly, how to vanish at the right moment. When Henry VIII noticed her, it wasn't because she threw herself at him, it was because she didn't. Unlike her sister Mary, who had been Henry's mistress years earlier, Anne refused to be a footnote. She played a long game, stringing along the king with promises of exclusivity without surrender. To Henry, it was intoxicating. To his court, it was terrifying. The mistress had ideas, and worse, principles. Their courtship stretched on for nearly 7 years. In that time, Henry tried and failed to obtain an annulment from Catherine. Anne, meanwhile, amassed enemies. Many viewed her as a usurper, a social climber, a foreign-influenced interloper. Her time in France never quite left her. But Anne also had supporters, those who saw in her the possibility of a reformed Protestant England. She read banned books, she debated theology. She wasn't just playing for a crown, she was playing for history. In 1533, Anne finally became queen. She was already pregnant with what Henry hoped would be a son. The coronation was lavish, the political fallout seismic. England broke from Rome, the Catholic Church's grip loosened, and the monarchy gained unprecedented control. But Anne had done the one thing a queen could never do. She delivered a daughter. That daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to rule longer and more successfully than any of her predecessors. But in 1533, she was a disappointment. Anne miscarried several times after that. Each loss eroded her position. Her assertiveness, once thrilling to Henry, became grating. Her sharp tongue, once proof of intelligence, became evidence of arrogance. And in the cutthroat atmosphere of Tudor court politics, the wolves began to circle. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. The accusations were outlandish. Her alleged lovers included her own brother, poets, musicians, and courtiers, many of whom were executed alongside her. The trials were rushed, the evidence flimsy, but the message was clear. Anne was no longer protected. And Henry, once willing to reshape the world to have her, now wanted her erased from it. Her fall was spectacular, public, choreographed. On the scaffold, she gave a carefully neutral speech, praising the king and accepting her fate with dignity. She dressed simply, she didn't scream. And when the sword fell, brought from France by a skilled executioner at Henry's request, it wasn't just a woman that died. It was a narrative. Anne Boleyn had rewritten the role of mistress, queen, and political player, and for that she was punished, not for her alleged lovers, but for being a woman who dared to change the terms of desire and power. The tragedy wasn't in her fall, it was in how predictable it became. But where Anne's downfall was a judicial performance cloaked in morality, the next woman wielded power from within the performance itself. A mistress who outshone the queen, a court favourite who dabbled in potions, rumours and rituals to keep her place in the Sun King's bed. Enter Madame de Montespan. 12. Countess Diane de Montespan. If there was ever a woman who turned scandal into status and seduction into strategy, it was Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemar, better known as Madame de Montespan. She was not merely the most famous mistress of Louis XIV, she was the monarch's shadow queen, presiding over the court of Versailles with more charisma than the legitimate royal family and far more influence than most ministers. She was witty, extravagant, politically astute, and, depending on whom you asked, either the epitome of courtly sophistication or a sorceress in silk. Born into one of the oldest noble families in France, Athénaïs had all the ingredients for a traditional high society life, a prestigious name, a sharp education, and beauty in a time when wit alone wouldn't suffice. But tradition bored her. She wasn't content to be married off and tucked into a corner of the court like fine furniture. She aimed higher, and she understood that at Versailles, influence didn't flow down from thrones, but out from bedrooms. By the time she joined the court of Louis XIV in the 1660s, Athénaïs was already married to the Marquis de Montespan. But marriage was merely a line in her biography, not a limitation. She began her rise as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Maria Theresa, but it was clear from the start that Athénaïs wasn't there to serve quietly. Her reputation for quick wit and effortless charm soon captured the king's attention. Not long after, she captured far more. Replacing Louis's then-mistress Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan ascended to the unofficial role of maîtresse en titre, a position that, while not legally recognized, came with its own court, its own rooms, and its own political leverage. She bore Louis 7 children, many of whom were legitimized and given high-ranking titles. But more than bearing heirs, she shaped the aesthetic and mood of the Sun King's reign. Versailles under Montespan became a theatre of elegance and excess. She curated art, sponsored writers, and defined fashion. But her power wasn't just decorative. She was a patron, a cultural architect, and whenever necessary, a ruthless protector of her position. Court politics were treacherous, and Montespan played them like a professional gambler. She cultivated alliances, managed rivalries, and kept the king captivated long after most royal affairs would have faded. Still, no star burns forever without casting shadows. By the late 1670s, rumours began to circulate that Montespan had been involved in darker forms of persuasion, specifically that she had sought out fortune-tellers and dabblers in what was delicately referred to as love magic. These allegations, now known as part of the infamous Affair of the Poisons, linked her name to a network of occult practitioners, scandalous rituals, and whispered sacrifices. While no definitive evidence ever tied her to criminal wrongdoing, the court did not require proof, only theatre. Louis, already turning toward the more pious Madame de Maintenon, began to cool. The king, who had once given Montespan palaces and diamonds, now offered polite distance. By 1691, she retired from court life, slipping from public view into religious retreat. Yet even in exile, her legacy lingered. Montespan's story is often simplified as one of ambition gone too far, but that misses the point. She didn't just chase power, she understood it. She manipulated its textures, learned its choreography, and made it hers in a world where women were rarely allowed more than decoration. If she used her beauty, it was as a tool. If she whispered to alchemists, it was out of desperation to survive in a court where irrelevance was a death sentence. Her children would go on to marry into royalty, her fashions would outlast her rivals, and her name would forever be tied to one of the most glittering and volatile courts in European history. And while Montespan's seductions were staged against the gold-drenched backdrops of Versailles, the next queen's scandals took place in the chilly corridors of England's Georgian monarchy, where propriety was enforced with public shame and where one woman's appetite for affection unravelled her entire royal marriage. Step quietly now into the troubled and untamed world of Queen Caroline of Brunswick. 13. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. When Queen Caroline of Brunswick arrived in England in 1795 to marry George, Prince of Wales, the entire court was already bracing for disaster. It wasn't just the ill-matched personalities, the political tension, or the considerable cultural divide between the stiff English court and Caroline's German upbringing. No, what made the marriage immediately volatile was that George already hated her, and she, upon meeting him, took one look and reportedly asked for a glass of brandy. That was their wedding day. Caroline was born in 1768 into the notoriously eccentric and scandal-prone House of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Her upbringing was privileged but emotionally threadbare. Her mother died young, her father was aloof, and the court she grew up in was more military barracks than cultural salon. She was known for her blunt speech, her lack of polish, and a distinctly un-English taste for emotional transparency. When she was selected as the bride for George, it was a match of pure political convenience. George was drowning in debt and needed Parliament to boost his income. Parliament agreed on the condition that he marry a Protestant princess and produce a legitimate heir. Enter Caroline stage left. From the beginning, the marriage was a theatrical farce. George found her crude, loud, and worst of all, unfashionable. He reportedly asked for more brandy after their wedding night. Caroline, in turn, found George pompous, cold and repellent. The two separated within a year, having fulfilled their dynastic duty by producing a single child, Princess Charlotte. After that, George returned to his longtime mistress. Caroline was exiled to a minor court role, given an allowance and politely erased from public view, or so he thought. Caroline, rather than retreating into obscurity, began cultivating a new kind of notoriety. She travelled across Europe, dispensing with traditional royal decorum and engaging in behaviour that shocked and delighted in equal measure. She drove around Naples in open carriages, took long holidays in Italy, and kept company with artists, musicians, and one particularly scandalous figure, Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian servant whom many believed was far more than just her chamberlain. Rumours exploded. It was whispered that Pergami dined at her table, rode in her carriage, and shared her bed. Caroline made no real effort to dispel these rumours. In fact, she seemed to revel in the discomfort they caused back home. For George, now Prince Regent, this was intolerable. He initiated a public campaign to strip her of her title and prevent her from being crowned queen when he ascended to the throne. What followed was one of the most sensational public spectacles in British history, the Pains and Penalties Bill of 1820. Parliament attempted to annul the royal marriage by accusing Caroline of adultery without a trial and based largely on circumstantial testimony from paid informants. It was royal scandal as national theatre. The people, however, took Caroline's side. They saw her as a wronged woman, abused by a decadent monarchy and punished for being too human. Crowds chanted her name in the streets. Riots broke out in protest. The bill failed. Still, Caroline's moment of triumph was fleeting. When George IV was crowned in 1821, she attempted to enter Westminster Abbey to claim her rightful place as queen. She was barred at the door. She tried a second entrance, then a third. Each time, she was turned away by guards. She left humiliated and ill, and just weeks later, she died. In the end, Caroline's legacy wasn't defined by her alleged affairs or defiance, but by the mirror she held up to her era. A reflection of royal hypocrisy, gendered double standards, and a public hungry for authenticity, however messy it came. And while Caroline's rebellion played out in carriages and courtrooms, the next empress's scandal was rooted in a very different past. One that began on the dusty stages of Constantinople's theatres and rose all the way to the gilded throne of Byzantium. From performer to empress, from scandal to sainthood, Theodora of Byzantium rewrote the rules entirely. 14. Empress Theodora of Byzantium. Before she was empress of the Byzantine Empire, Theodora was a child of the margins, born around 500 CE, not in a palace or noble estate, but likely in the back corridors of Constantinople's Hippodrome, the massive arena where sport, spectacle, and sedition collided. Her father was a bear trainer. Her mother was an actress. Her early life was steeped in noise, grit, and performance, an origin story that later historians either romanticized or reviled, depending on how comfortable they were with a woman who rose too far, too fast. Much of what we know, or think we know, about Theodora comes from Procopius, the imperial court historian whose secret history is less biography and more character assassination by candlelight. He claimed Theodora had worked as a performer and courtesan in her youth, recounting with theatrical disdain how she captivated audiences not just with her acting, but with what he described as scandalous displays of erotic spectacle. But Procopius had an axe to grind and a flair for melodrama. Whether Theodora's pre-imperial life was quite so salacious or simply the usual survival story of a lower-class woman navigating the entertainment world of late antiquity, we'll never know. What matters is this: Theodora started low, and she climbed high. By her early 20s, Theodora had reinvented herself. She left the stage, reportedly underwent a religious awakening, and began a new life as a wool spinner in Alexandria, a career move that sounds humble but symbolically was profound. Wool spinning was a traditionally virtuous occupation for women, associated with chastity and domestic integrity. It was a public declaration of transformation, or perhaps just a clever way to rebrand. By the time she returned to Constantinople, Theodora was no longer a public performer. She was a political player. Around 522, she met Justinian, a rising star in the imperial court, the nephew of Emperor Justin I, and a man with enough ambition to level cities and remake empires. Theodora captivated him, not just with beauty, though she was famed for that, but with intellect, wit, and an iron will. Against considerable resistance, including from those who thought her background unsuitable, Justinian married her. When he became emperor in 527, she became his co-ruler, not in name only, but in practice. Theodora didn't fade into the background as many imperial wives did. She took an active role in governance, appeared beside Justinian at court, and influenced policies, especially those affecting women and the poor. She championed laws that expanded women's rights in divorce, protected former performers from exploitation, and supported shelters for women escaping violence. She wasn't just dressing the throne, she was sitting in it. But her past, or at least its reputation, never left her. To her enemies, she was always the actress who got lucky. To the moralists, she was a cautionary tale of beauty in the wrong hands. To the public, she was something stranger, a symbol of contradiction, a woman who ruled with imperial gravitas, but whose origins defied every expectation of nobility. Her defining moment came during the Nika riots of 532, when Constantinople erupted in flames, and Justinian considered fleeing the capital to save his crown and his life. It was Theodora who stopped him. Royalty is a fine burial shroud, she is said to have told him, insisting that emperors don't run from mobs. Her steel, not his, held the throne that night. The rebellion was crushed. Her legend was sealed. Theodora died in 548, possibly of cancer, leaving behind a kingdom reshaped by her presence. Centuries later, the Orthodox Church canonized her as a saint. The girl from the hippodrome, the supposed courtesan, the empress who rose from spectacle to sovereignty, was now divine. Her story remains unsettling, not because of its scandal, but because of its success. She outlived her past. She outmaneuvered her critics. She proved that power doesn't always come in robes or bloodlines. It can rise from the sand of an arena, cloaked in determination. And yet, even Theodora's iron resolve has its modern mirror. A royal woman who refused to be traded like currency, who turned down emperors, and who played politics with flirtation and flair. Christina of Denmark wasn't crowned, but she never needed to be. 15. Christina of Denmark. In the grand game of royal matchmaking, most princesses were expected to smile sweetly, sign the betrothal papers, and proceed to spend the rest of their lives as decorative assets in some far-off court. But Christina of Denmark, born in 1521 and orphaned by age 6, never seemed interested in playing by those rules. She was titled, beautiful and thoroughly inconvenient, a widow before 20, a duchess in her own right, and a woman who turned down kings with the kind of charm that left diplomats both disarmed and defeated. Christina's early years were shaped by turbulence. Her father, King Christian II of Denmark, was deposed when she was just a child, and her family spent much of her early life in exile. In an era when royal girls were taught obedience and embroidery, Christina learned negotiation and resilience. She was sent to live under the protection of her Habsburg relatives, notably her powerful aunt, Margaret of Austria, and later her cousin, Emperor Charles V. These weren't just guardians, they were shapers of empires, and they made sure Christina was trained accordingly. By age 16, Christina was married to Francesco II Sforza, the Duke of Milan. It was a strategic match, engineered by her Habsburg relatives to maintain control over Italian territories. Francesco was sickly and considerably older, but Christina did her duty, assuming her role with diplomatic poise. His death 3 years later left her a widow with an impressive title, a valuable inheritance, and, most importantly, a taste of freedom that most women of her rank never experienced. Once widowed, Christina became one of the most sought-after bachelorettes in Europe. Her hand was courted by monarchs and noblemen alike, but she was not in a hurry to remarry. And this is where her legend begins, not with scandalous affairs, but with the way she turned courtship into theatre. One of her most famous rejections came in the form of Henry VIII's marriage proposal. Yes, that Henry VIII, in 1538, just 2 years after executing Anne Boleyn and 1 year before discarding Anne of Cleves, he sent envoys to woo Christina. The mission was diplomatic, wrapped in velvet and veiled threats. Christina received the portrait of the king and heard his promises. Then, with a sly smile, she reportedly remarked that if she had 2 heads, she might consider marrying him. It was a devastating line, sharp, political, and so quotable that it travelled across Europe before Henry's delegation even made it home. Christina's refusal wasn't just a personal choice, it was a masterstroke of royal branding. She wasn't just declining a husband, she was defining herself on her own terms. In the decades that followed, Christina continued to walk the tightrope between autonomy and expectation. She flirted with power, played suitors against one another, and maintained her status without surrendering her independence. Rumors of affairs inevitably followed. After all, a beautiful young duchess who refused to remarry must be hiding something. Courtiers speculated about secret lovers. Ambassadors whispered about dalliances with soldiers, artists, and visiting nobles. But no scandals ever broke the surface, and Christina offered no explanations. She didn't need to. Mystery was part of the armor. Eventually she did marry, on her own terms. In 1541, she wed Francis, Duke of Lorraine. It was a quieter match, but still strategic, aligning her with one of Europe's most powerful families. Even in marriage, she continued to play politics, acting as regent for her son after Francis's death and involving herself in the dynastic chessboard of the Holy Roman Empire. Christina of Denmark may not have left a trail of confirmed lovers or dramatic exiles, but her life reads like a slow-burning seduction of power itself. She was the rare royal woman who understood that saying no could be more powerful than saying yes, especially when the world expects your silence. And while Christina mastered the art of courtly resistance, the next royal rebel did the opposite. She leaned fully into her role as the scandalous sister, the party princess, and the reluctant symbol of a monarchy caught between duty and desire. Let the gin flow and the headlines roll. Princess Margaret is about to make her entrance. 16. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. There are royal scandals, and then there is Princess Margaret, scandal incarnate, smoked in cigarettes, clinking with ice in her whiskey glass, and forever caught between palace duty and the velvet ropes of London's nightlife. She wasn't supposed to rule, and so she didn't. Instead, she burned, not out of rebellion exactly, but out of sheer inability to be small in a family that demanded it. Born in 1930 as the second daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, Margaret Rose was technically a spare, but never a subtle one. Where her sister, the future Queen Elizabeth II, mastered silence and stoicism, Margaret wore her emotions like a tiara, visible, heavy, and glittering. She was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and famously difficult to manage. The press adored her, so did the public, until they didn't. Her first great love, the defining heartbreak of her life, was Group Captain Peter Townsend, a war hero, equerry, and divorced man. When they fell in love in the early 1950s, Britain was caught between post-war prudence and the slow thaw of modernity. Divorce in the royal family was still radioactive. The Church of England wouldn't permit Margaret to marry him without consequence, and the monarchy wasn't about to bend for the sake of passion. So Margaret was given a choice: marry Townsend and lose her titles, her income, and her position, or walk away. In 1955, after months of will she won't she agony played out in tabloid headlines, she made her decision. Mindful of the church's teaching, she announced, "I have decided not to marry." The public wept, so did she, but if she couldn't have love, she would have freedom, sort of. Margaret retreated into a glittering kind of rebellion. She became a fixture of elite society, smoking in Kensington Palace, partying with celebrities in Mustique, and developing a reputation for both charm and sharp cruelty. Her circle included Mick Jagger, Peter Sellers, and the entire fading glamour of swinging London. Wherever the royals said no, Margaret leaned hard into why not. In 1960, she shocked the establishment again by marrying photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, commoner, bohemian, bisexual, and perhaps most alarmingly, artistic. Theirs was the first televised royal wedding, watched by 300 million people. For a moment, it felt like Margaret had rewritten the rules, marrying for love on her terms and dragging the monarchy into the modern world. But the cracks came quickly. The marriage was passionate, yes, but also volatile. Margaret's flair for drama met Armstrong Jones's own appetite for freedom, and what began as a creative union soon became a battlefield. Affairs followed, allegedly on both sides. Margaret was linked to younger men, artists, aristocrats, and at least one gardener. In 1976, photographs emerged of her on holiday with a 25-year-old lover, Roddy Llewellyn. The press had a field day. The palace had a migraine. That same year, Margaret and Anthony separated. 2 years later, they divorced, the first royal divorce since Henry VIII, though thankfully with less beheading. It marked a turning point. Margaret, once the glamorous rebel, was now middle-aged and increasingly sidelined by a public less tolerant of royal misbehaviour and more obsessed with her older sister's unshakable dignity. But even in decline, Margaret remained iconic. She was never ordinary. Her tragedies were Shakespearean, her parties legendary, and her defiance tragic in its elegance. She seemed to know, perhaps better than anyone, that monarchy is theatre, and she was determined to play her part in full costume, curtain call be damned. When she died in 2002, just weeks before her mother, the headlines mourned her as the last princess. But Margaret wasn't the last. She was simply the most unapologetically human, flawed, impulsive, luminous, and permanently out of step with the institution that raised her. And if Margaret's rebellion was painted in gin and eyeliner, the next empress's discontent came dressed in corsets, veils, and whispered heartbreak. She was a living portrait of beauty and melancholy, with a crown on her head and a storm in her soul. Meet Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi to some, but never truly known to anyone. 17. Empress Elizabeth of Austria. She was called Sisi, but the nickname was about the only thing informal in the life of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. For all the adoration she received, painted like a romantic heroine in countless portraits, pressed into the collective imagination like a fairy tale stamp, her real story was far more fractured. Behind the wreaths of braids and the waist cinched to impossibility was a woman who hated her crown, despised her cage, and quietly dismantled the expectations of her empire, one strange decision at a time. Born in 1837 into the Bavarian Wittelsbach family, Elizabeth was never meant to be an empress. She was raised in the countryside, barefoot, horse-loving and free-spirited, a girl more likely to be found climbing trees than rehearsing court etiquette. But destiny, or something resembling it, had other plans. When she was just 15, she accompanied her mother and older sister Helene to meet Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. Helene was the intended bride, but Franz took one look at Sisi and decided, publicly, impulsively, that he wanted the younger sister instead. She married him at 16. From the beginning, it was a mismatch not of affection, but of systems. Franz Joseph was loyal, disciplined, devout. Sisi was allergic to control, wilting under protocol, and the ever-watchful eye of her domineering mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. Her role was clear: produce heirs, attend functions, smile silently. She did the first, 4 children in quick succession, but never quite mastered the rest. It wasn't long before she began disappearing. Cece spent much of her life fleeing, first from the Viennese court, then from motherhood, then from the very idea of monarchy. She took refuge in language, learning Hungarian fluently and advocating passionately for the country's autonomy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was no ceremonial gesture. She became a political asset in Hungary, winning hearts where her husband had struggled. It was perhaps the only place she ever felt genuinely respected. But even in politics, her presence was elusive. She travelled compulsively, almost obsessively. Greece, Madeira, England, Ireland, always moving, always just out of reach. Her health was frequently cited as the reason, but her condition seemed less physical than existential. She loathed being looked at, yet insisted on cultivating her image to mythical standards. Her beauty regimen bordered on monastic, hours of hair care, strict diets, intense exercise. She weighed herself daily. She wore only black for decades after the death of her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, in 1889. It was mourning, yes, but also armor. Then there were the rumors. Cece was, by most accounts, charming, particularly with younger men. Her long absences from court and marriage gave rise to endless speculation. One Hungarian noble, Count Gyula Andrássy, was whispered to be more than just a political ally. Their correspondence hints at deep affection, mutual admiration, and perhaps something more, but no affair was ever confirmed, which of course only made the speculation grow. She was too beautiful to be alone, too lonely not to seek affection, too unconventional to follow rules. The public filled in the blanks with fantasy. She never denied them. By the end of her life, Cece was a ghost in her own empire, a widow in spirit long before her husband's death, wandering from palace to palace with little luggage and less interest in ceremony. She famously refused bodyguards, claiming that no one would want to harm an old, tired woman. In 1898, while walking in Geneva, she was stabbed in the chest by an Italian anarchist who had no idea who she was. She died hours later, quietly and almost anonymously. It was an ending strangely in line with the life she had tried to live, ungraspable, poetic, and wrapped in contradiction. Empress Elizabeth wasn't a seductress in the classic sense. She seduced with distance, with mystery, with a refusal to be consumed. Her legacy is one of silent rebellion against monarchy, motherhood, conformity, and fame. And if Cece was the empress who floated above it all, the next queen was determined to meet life head-on, riding into war zones, charming diplomats, and collecting admirers like medals. Daring, dazzling, and impossible to ignore, Queen Marie of Romania is about to take center stage. 18. Queen Marie of Romania. Queen Marie of Romania was, by all accounts, a force of nature, equal parts fairy tale princess, war heroine, political tactician, and romantic myth. She was born into the great palaces of Europe and somehow managed to live a life that outshone even the most glamorous of her lineage. Granddaughter of Queen Victoria, cousin to the Russian Tsar, and eventually queen of a newly modernizing Balkan state, Marie wasn't supposed to rule a nation with her bare hands. She was supposed to smile, marry well, and stand quietly near important men. But Queen Marie had other plans. Born in 1875 as Princess Marie of Edinburgh, she was raised with one foot in the polished English world of the Windsors and the other in the expansive, unpredictable orbit of continental royalty. She was intelligent, intuitive, and, by the time she reached adolescence, already viewed as a shimmering prize in the dynastic marriage market. Suitors were many, but the chosen one was Prince Ferdinand of Romania, heir to a country trying to carve out its identity in the shadow of European empires. It was not a love match, and that fact would linger under the surface for much of their marriage. Romania was a cultural shock for the young, refined Marie. The court was rigid, the public skeptical, and her husband quiet and dutiful but emotionally distant. It didn't take long for the cracks to form. Marie, unused to being confined, sought solace in attention, adventure, and, according to endless diplomatic reports and well-fed gossip columns, romantic liaisons that often blurred the line between companionship and courtship. Her most infamous connection was with Babu Știrbei, a handsome and influential Romanian nobleman who was a constant presence at her side. Their relationship lasted decades and drew murmurs from nearly every political corner of Europe. Știrbei acted as her advisor, confidant, and, if the rumors are to be believed, the father of at least one of her children. But like all great royal entanglements, nothing was ever confirmed, and Marie, master of image and narrative, let speculation do the rest. And then came the war. World War I transformed Marie from a decorative royal into a national symbol. While Ferdinand hesitated and Romanian politicians wavered, Marie became the face of defiance. She visited hospitals, rode to the front lines, comforted wounded soldiers, and wore her Red Cross uniform like armor. The public, once wary of their foreign-born queen, now adored her. She was called Mama Regina, Mother Queen, and her presence was so politically potent that even foreign leaders noted it. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, reportedly quipped that Romania had the only man in the Romanian government, and she's a woman. After the war, during the Paris Peace Conference, Marie did something no queen was supposed to do. She lobbied, personally, boldly, dressed in furs, flashing royal charm and diplomatic cunning. She campaigned for her country's interests with a determination that startled the old guard of European statesmen. And she got results. Romania's post-war borders expanded, her legend grew, but the fairy tale had its shadows. Marie's personal life remained turbulent. Her marriage, while never hostile, was hollow. Her children rebelled, particularly Carol II, whose disastrous reign would undo much of what she tried to build. And through it all, her romantic entanglements remained the subject of endless fascination. Artists, poets, generals, many were linked to her in whispers, though few with evidence. What mattered wasn't what Marie did, but how unbothered she seemed by what people thought she did. She wasn't trying to be a saint, she was trying to be whole. In her later years, Marie turned to writing, publishing memoirs and reflections that were part royal propaganda, part deeply personal confession. In them, she acknowledged her mistakes, mourned her losses, and celebrated her passions. She never apologized for being too much. She simply refused to be less. Queen Marie of Romania wasn't just a royal nymph in the pages of gossip. She was a ruler who understood the political power of presence, the human need for connection, and the rare ability to enchant not just men, but nations. And if Marie wielded charm like a weapon, the next Christina used hers more strategically, cloaking personal freedom in courtly maneuvering and marital refusal. She turned down kings, intrigued courtiers, and reshaped her widowhood into an empire of autonomy. Meet Christina of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the medieval queen who simply didn't care what you thought. 19. Queen Christina of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. History didn't exactly expect Queen Christina of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden to live quietly. To be fair, it rarely hands over 3 kingdoms to a woman without a few complications attached. But even by the standards of medieval royalty, Christina's life was a tangle of politics, passion, and polite refusal to conform, especially when it came to what a widow was supposed to be. Born in the early 14th century as a daughter of Valdemar IV of Denmark, Christina entered the world at a time when women were royal currency, traded, exchanged, and often discarded once their political value expired. Her marriage to King Magnus IV of Sweden and Norway was one such transaction, designed to consolidate power, strengthen ties between Scandinavia's fractious monarchies, and presumably keep Christina safely within the boundaries of her role. The marriage was official. The alliance was real, but whether the affection was mutual is still a matter of historical shrugs. Magnus was a complicated ruler, frequently accused of mismanaging the realm, favoring unpopular advisors, and, in some accounts, displaying more interest in court favourites than in his wife. Christina, meanwhile, was not content to simply fade into the background. She was intelligent, politically aware, and keenly observant of court dynamics. She watched, she remembered, and when the time came, she acted. After years of tension and unrest, King Magnus was effectively pushed aside by their son, Haakon VI. The political shift fractured the royal family, and Christina, now a queen in name but not in power, faced the fate many royal women shared: irrelevance. Except she didn't vanish. She recalibrated. Instead of withdrawing into religious piety or quiet retreat, Christina took her dowager status and turned it into political capital. She moved through Denmark and Norway, not as a grieving royal, but as a commanding figure with her own network of allies, estates, and influence. Medieval chronicles began to murmur about her increasingly unconventional behavior, not criminal, not treasonous, but unseemly for a queen widow. That, of course, was shorthand for still alive and enjoying herself. One particular source of scandal was the suggestion that Christina maintained romantic liaisons after her husband's fall from power. Some even claimed after his death, though records are hazy. In an age when widowhood was synonymous with withdrawal, the idea of a royal woman continuing to live and love on her own terms was unsettling to those recording the past. Christina was rumored to have taken noble lovers, formed emotionally charged attachments with powerful men, and navigated court intrigue with flirtation as much as strategy. But let's be clear, the line between rumor and reality in medieval court life was always blurred. For a woman with land, power, and no husband to anchor her, suspicion was inevitable. Every friendship could be recast as seduction, every private meeting a moral offense. Christina's supposed impropriety may have been nothing more than a refusal to fade, something far more threatening to the medieval imagination than any actual affair. What makes Christina's legacy so unusual is that she didn't suffer for her independence the way so many royal women did. She wasn't exiled or executed or slandered into the shadows. She simply lived, stubbornly, richly, and in control of her fate longer than many of her contemporaries. And while later historians would debate the accuracy of the more salacious claims, they would all agree on one thing: she was not the kind of queen who waited to be written about. She authored her own margins. Christina died around 1363, remembered in fragments, some reverent, some mocking, all fascinated. She was a relic of a fading age, a woman whose status gave her just enough leverage to sidestep the grave expectations of royal widowhood. Whether her lovers were real or invented, they served the same purpose. Proof that Queen Christina, unlike so many others, remained the main character of her own life. And if Christina danced through widowhood with defiant elegance, the next woman crashed through Bavarian respectability like a tempest in heels. She was an actress, a dancer, and briefly a royal mistress whose affair would topple a king. Make way for Lola Montez, the countess who made Bavaria blush. 20. Countess Lola Montez. Lola Montez was not born a countess. She wasn't born royal or even particularly close to nobility. In fact, she wasn't even born Lola Montez. She came into the world in 1821 as Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in County Sligo, Ireland, a colonel's daughter with a sharp tongue, a wild streak, and a relentless disinterest in staying where she was put. But by the time she was finished, she had seduced a king, destabilized a monarchy, and become one of Europe's most infamous cautionary tales. Lola was, from an early age, inconvenient. Her family moved to India during her childhood, and after her father's early death, she was packed off to boarding schools in Britain. It did not go well. The story of her first scandal came early, an elopement at 16 with a much older officer whom she later left in a flurry of drama. When she returned to the continent, she reinvented herself completely. Eliza Gilbert disappeared. Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer of questionable nobility and undeniable magnetism, was born. Her career as a performer was never critically acclaimed, but Lola didn't need critical acclaim. She needed attention, and she knew exactly how to get it. She performed in Paris, Warsaw, London, and Vienna, her dancing more notable for its suggestive flair than its technical merit. Her signature piece was a provocative number called The Spider Dance, in which she would supposedly discover imaginary spiders crawling on her body and flick them off, much to the delight and occasional outrage of male audiences. It was scandalous. It was brilliant. It worked, but her fame would reach its peak not on the stage, but in the palace of King Ludwig I of Bavaria. They met in 1846, and from that moment, Lola went from travelling performer to royal mistress in less time than it takes to light a scandal. Ludwig, an aging romantic and patron of the arts, was completely captivated. He installed her in court with the title Countess of Landsfeld, gifted her a state income, and ignored the rising chorus of outrage from nobles, clergy, and citizens alike. Lola, for her part, was not interested in discretion. She attended council meetings. She advised the king. She alienated nearly every member of his court with her fiery temper, outspoken views, and utter refusal to defer to anyone. Even worse, for the conservative establishment, she was believed to hold radical political sympathies. Her influence over Ludwig began to cast a shadow on his rule. Riots broke out, students protested, ministers resigned. Eventually, in 1848, the year Europe caught fire with revolutions, Bavaria joined the unrest. Ludwig was forced to choose between his throne and his mistress. He chose Lola. Then, a few weeks later, he was forced to abdicate. Lola fled Bavaria in disguise, her position as court mistress now just another chapter in a biography already bloated with reinvention. She didn't stop. In the years that followed, Lola travelled to Switzerland, London, and eventually the United States, where she lectured, performed, and continued to mystify polite society. In San Francisco, she reportedly shot a man who insulted her. He survived. In Australia, she gave moral lectures to gold miners. She styled herself as a penitent, a philosopher, a survivor of love, and depending on the year, she might have believed it. Lola Montez died in 1861, aged only 39. Her beauty faded, but her myth intact. She was called a fraud, a seductress, a ruinous woman. But she was also undeniably a creature of her own making, one who refused to accept the fate handed to women of her station and instead wrote a louder, riskier, far more interesting version. And while Lola's lovers brought down thrones, the next woman made seduction into a royal job title. She was the last mistress of a dying king, the embodiment of late Bourbon decadence, and the glittering ghost of Versailles' final gasp. Let us enter the gilded chambers of Madame du Barry. 21. Madame du Barry. By the time Madame du Barry made her debut at the court of Louis XV, Versailles was already rotting beneath its gilded ceilings. The age of powdered wigs and velvet whispers was nearing its final act, and du Barry, the last official royal mistress of France, arrived just in time to take a bow before the curtain fell. Born Jeanne Bécu in 1743 to a seamstress in Lorraine, her beginnings were humble, her ascent improbable, and her transformation nothing short of theatrical. Raised on the fringes of society, she spent her early years drifting through convent schools and wealthy households, collecting charm, education, and an almost preternatural understanding of how men worked. By her late teens, she was working in a fashionable Parisian salon as a sort of conversational ornament, one of many beautiful women employed to flatter and amuse the powerful. Jeanne didn't just flirt her way upward. She studied her surroundings, refined her persona, and carefully stepped from hostess's assistant to kept woman to courtesan in demand. She wasn't noble, but she didn't need to be. She had wit, presence, and an ability to look expensive in any room, which is precisely what brought her to the attention of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a pimp disguised as a nobleman who recognized her potential and packaged her for the one client that mattered, the King of France. Louis XV, by then in his 60s, was decades past his days of glory. Once called the well-beloved, he was now cynical, indulgent, and increasingly reclusive. His previous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, had died in 1764, leaving a vacuum in both his heart and his politics. Du Barry was introduced in 1768, and it was lust at first sight, or at least something like it. The king was enchanted. Jeanne, with her golden hair and radiant smile, was transformed overnight from courtesan to maîtresse en titre. But Versailles had rules. To officially hold the title of royal mistress, one needed a noble name, so she was quickly married off to Du Barry's brother, received a title, and was presented at court, an event so politically radioactive that half the nobility refused to attend. The court detested her. She was seen as vulgar, uneducated, and worst of all, common. Marie Antoinette, then the teenage Dauphine, famously refused to speak to her for years. But Du Barry, while not a political force like her predecessor Pompadour, held her own. She knew what the king wanted: amusement, affection, escape, and she delivered. She commissioned extravagant jewelry, supported artists, and kept the aging monarch entertained in a world that was beginning to feel like a prelude to collapse. Of course, enemies gathered. Her past as a courtesan never stopped being used against her. Caricatures circulated, depicting her as a national embarrassment. Pamphlets mocked her influence, suggesting that France was being ruled from her boudoir. And when Louis XV died in 1774, so too did her protection. Exiled from court by Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, Du Barry lived in relative quiet for a time, though not without a rotating cast of admirers and companions. She built a lavish villa, continued her patronage of the arts, and by most accounts mellowed. But as the revolution swept across France, her past, like so many others, caught up with her. Former lovers became liabilities. Her association with the Ancien Regime sealed her fate. She was arrested, tried, and sentenced during the Reign of Terror. Her final days were reportedly filled with panic and appeals. The charm that once held kings now failed to move a revolutionary tribunal. But Jeanne Bécu's legacy isn't a tragedy. It's a testament to transformation. She was born a nobody and died a legend. She understood the strange alchemy of power and pleasure, and she played her role until the very end. And if Du Barry was the swan song of Bourbon indulgence, the next queen was its sister Echo, equally extravagant, equally infamous, and equally doomed by the politics of both desire and defiance. Step now into the court of Naples, where Queen Mary Caroline reigned with iron grace and no shortage of romantic speculation. 22. Queen Mary Caroline of Naples. If you took the defiant fire of her sister Marie Antoinette, blended it with the cold cunning of a seasoned political operator, and added just a dash of Mediterranean heat, you'd begin to get a sense of Queen Mary Caroline of Naples. She was not just a royal spouse, nor merely a tragic figure in the theatre of collapsing empires. Mary Caroline was a sovereign who didn't wait to be handed power. She seized it, wore it with conviction, and ruled a kingdom entangled in intrigue, affection, and scandal. Born in 1752 as the 13th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, Mary Caroline was raised in one of the most powerfully orchestrated dynastic families in Europe. Her sister Marie Antoinette was sent to France. Mary Caroline, at the age of 16, was dispatched to Naples to marry King Ferdinand IV, a man widely described as, shall we say, underwhelming. He hunted obsessively, mumbled his way through court, and was more interested in fish than foreign affairs. But Mary Caroline was not there to be entertained. She was there to rule. Within a few years, she took control of the kingdom's politics through shrewd manipulation of court alliances and her own sharp intellect. In 1777, she secured a seat on the Council of State, essentially giving her co-sovereign authority. Ferdinand, content in his hobbies, let her govern, and govern she did. Mary Caroline forged alliances, modernized elements of the Neapolitan court, and became a fierce opponent of the French Revolution. Her hatred of the movement was personal. Her sister had been executed in Paris, and Mary Caroline saw the guillotine not as a symbol of justice, but as a blade hovering over every throne in Europe. Her commitment to crushing revolutionary influence became obsessive, and in the shadows of her political crusade, her personal life became more complicated. Enter John Acton. Acton was a British-born admiral who rose through the ranks of the Neapolitan Navy and eventually became Prime Minister. Handsome, ambitious, and politically ruthless, he quickly became Mary Caroline's closest advisor and, depending on the source, her lover. Their relationship was widely speculated upon at the time and remains the subject of scholarly side-eye to this day. They were inseparable in court affairs. Acton's rapid accumulation of titles and influence was so blatant that foreign ambassadors openly joked that he was king in everything but name. Was their relationship romantic? Possibly. Was it politically intimate to the point of near obsession? Absolutely. Acton's loyalty to Mary Caroline was unwavering, and her trust in him reshaped the court. The two orchestrated purges of liberal nobles, strengthened royalist military efforts, and essentially ruled Naples as a duo. Gossip bloomed, cartoons mocked, even among monarchist allies, whispers circulated about the true nature of their partnership. As with many powerful women, throughout history, Mary Caroline's perceived sexuality was used against her. She was called power-hungry, overbearing, licentious, not for any confirmed misconduct, but for the audacity of governing with autonomy. A woman who wielded power was automatically presumed to have seduced her way into it. Mary Caroline, like so many royal women before her, was punished in rumor for what she accomplished in fact. Her reign eventually collapsed under the weight of French military pressure. Naples was invaded. The royal family fled to Sicily under British protection. Her grip on power weakened, her image tarnished by exile and political failure. She spent her final years as a diminished figure, surrounded by courtiers who remembered her glory days and gossips who had never stopped talking. But Mary Caroline's story isn't one of defeat. It's a tale of a queen who ruled fiercely, defied expectation, and made history flinch. She was not a footnote to her husband's reign. She was the reign. And while Mary Caroline used power to wage war and rule states, the next empress would use exile itself to rewrite her narrative. Her throne lost, her court gone, she became a myth in silk, haunted by loss, surrounded by beauty, and quietly accused of finding comfort in companionship. Meet Empress Eugénie de Montijo, the last empress of France. 23. Empress Eugénie de Montijo. She was the last empress of France, and fittingly, she lived like the final chapter of a romantic novel being read aloud to a room that had already been abandoned. Empress Eugénie de Montijo, wife of Napoleon III, Spanish countess by birth, imperial consort by accident of charm and timing, was equal parts spectacle and survivor. Her reign glittered with diamonds, scandals, and strategic silences, and when it all collapsed, she did not vanish. She became something more enduring. The ghost of a vanished empire, walking through European salons with a crown no longer on her head, but never quite off it either. Born in 1826 in Granada, Spain, to a noble family of declining fortune, Eugénie was raised with a mixture of aristocratic grace and bourgeois ambition. Her mother, the true architect of her future, took her daughters across Europe, showcasing them in royal courts like prized artwork, well-framed, well-groomed, and perfectly positioned for admiration. Eugénie wasn't the most beautiful woman in the room, but she had something more valuable: presence. She spoke several languages, rode horses like a soldier, and knew precisely when to look impressed or indifferent. By the time she caught the eye of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Napoleon III, she wasn't just eligible, she was irresistible. Their courtship was famously unconventional. Napoleon III was a bachelor emperor, constantly flanked by mistresses and assumed to be unmarriageable. But when he met Eugenie, the story goes, he was smitten. When he attempted a more casual dalliance, she coolly informed him that if he wanted her, he would need to marry her. Against every prediction, he did. In 1853, they were wed, and Eugenie, raised a noble woman, trained as a flirt and crowned as empress, stepped onto the world stage not as a passive figurehead, but as a modern, unpredictable force. She wasn't content to be decorative. She advised Napoleon, hosted diplomats, toured factories, met with generals, and even served as regent during his absences. Her tastes shaped the Second Empire: fashion, architecture, protocol, diplomacy. She was not adored by all, but she was impossible to ignore. And of course, the gossip followed. Eugenie's reign was riddled with accusations: too Spanish, too Catholic, too proud, too fashionable, too present. She was said to dominate her husband, to meddle in military matters, to whisper in Napoleon's ear about politics and alliances. She was blamed for France's ill-fated adventures in Mexico, and when the Franco-Prussian War erupted in 1870, her critics pounced. But even before the fall of the empire, there had been whispers of a more personal kind. Rumors circulated that in her later years as empress, particularly during her husband's declining health, Eugenie had turned to private consolations. Male confidants became subjects of speculation. Diplomats, military officers, even her son's tutors. These supposed affairs were never proven and rarely confirmed, but the implications hung in the air like lingering perfume. In exile, the rumors intensified. After all, what else was there to say about a deposed empress living in an English mansion surrounded by portraits of the past? And yet, Eugenie never answered them. She simply endured. After the empire collapsed and Napoleon III died in 1873, Eugenie withdrew to Farnborough Hill in England, where she maintained a kind of imperial ghost court. She wore black. She received guests. She kept her chin high and her answers vague. In 1879, tragedy struck again when her only son, the Prince Imperial, was killed fighting in the Anglo-Zulu War. With his death, the Bonaparte dynasty effectively ended, and Eugenie's isolation was complete, but still she remained visible. She travelled. She was received by Queen Victoria. She consulted with popes. She offered opinions on politics well into her 80s. Wherever she went, people whispered, not just about her past, but about the possibility that she had once been something more. Not just a figurehead, not just a wife, but a woman who had loved deeply, ruled fiercely, and dared to live after her script had ended. When Eugenie died in 1920, she was 94 years old, outliving nearly every enemy, rival, and rumour. She was the last person alive to have worn the crown of France. And while history never quite knew what to do with her, it couldn't forget her either. And if Eugenie haunted history with dignity and silence, the next woman used her court to scandalize it outright. Master of ceremonies in one of the most decadent, whispered-about entourages in Europe. She didn't just tolerate lovers. She surrounded herself with them, and if they weren't hers, they were on her payroll. Enter Catherine de Medici and her infamous flying squadron. 24. Catherine de Medici. For a queen who married into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, Catherine de Medici spent much of her life being underestimated, first as a foreign bride, then as a childless consort, and finally as a widow ruling behind a veil of black lace and long memories. But what Catherine lacked in battlefield clout, she more than made up for in soft power. Information, influence, and the careful placement of people in just the right rooms. And while her personal affairs remain opaque, her court was legendary for its very public sensual strategy. An elite circle of hand-picked women nicknamed the L'Escadron Volant or the Flying Squadron. These weren't spies in the shadows. They were dressed in silks, dripping in jewels, and trained in the delicate arts of flirtation and information gathering. Their mission was deceptively simple: seduce powerful men and report back. It was the 16th century version of state surveillance, coated in perfume, wit, and suggestive smiles. But beneath the powdered faces and jeweled bodices was a ruthlessly efficient intelligence network, orchestrated by a queen who knew that in a court full of daggers, the sharpest weapons were often corseted. Catherine was born in Florence in 1519, a Medici by blood but not by fortune. Orphaned young and raised under the watchful eye of powerful relatives, she was married off at 14 to Prince Henry of France, later King Henry II. The match was political, not passionate, and complicated by the presence of Diane de Poitiers, Henry's considerably older mistress, who effectively controlled court access and the king's attention. Catherine played the long game. She watched, she waited. It wasn't until Henry's death in 1559 that she fully emerged from the shadows. As the mother of three successive kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, Catherine governed through regency and maternal dominance. France, fractured by religious war and political unrest, became a stage of constant compromise. Catherine's solution? Get close to the people who mattered, very close if necessary. This is where the flying squadron entered the frame. Composed of beautiful, intelligent women loyal to Catherine, the squadron wasn't just decorative. They were chosen to mingle with ambassadors, noblemen, and military officers. Their seductions weren't accidents, they were policy. One favorite, Isabelle de Limeuil, was reportedly used to extract secrets from Spanish envoys. Another, Louise de la Béraudière, was known for charming Protestant leaders. Their loyalty was to Catherine, their intimacy to whomever was politically inconvenient. Rumors inevitably spread, especially about Catherine herself. While there is little concrete evidence that she had lovers of her own, chroniclers and political enemies alike accused her of immorality, sorcery, and even orchestrating orgies in the Louvre. These were likely exaggerations, but they served their purpose. Paint Catherine as dangerous, and to many men in power, a woman with strategic intelligence and access to secrets was always dangerous, especially when she made no effort to play dumb about it. But what truly defined Catherine wasn't just her court of flirtation. It was her ability to survive. She lived through the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the collapse of Valois authority, and endless betrayals from those who once kissed her hand. She watched children die, kingdoms splinter, and alliances crumble. Yet she remained standing, black-clad, politically nimble, and always watching. By the time of her death in 1589, Catherine had become a symbol, part witch, part mother, part stateswoman. Whether she was feared or respected didn't seem to matter. She had played a man's game in a man's world and outlasted most of the men in it. And if Catherine built an empire of whispers and velvet espionage, the next queen was myth before she was memory, a shadow of the medieval past whose story reads more like a fable than a chronicle. Her name was Christina, her reputation unruly, unfaithful, and unforgettable. 25. Queen Christina of Denmark, 12th century mythicized. In the dense fog of medieval history, where saints and sinners often wear the same crown, Queen Christina of Denmark stands less as a recorded monarch and more as a myth made flesh. The facts of her life are scarce, the details distorted. What survives is a haunting silhouette, a foreign queen in a strange land, remembered not for battles or edicts, but for her appetite, or rather, the one medieval ballads claimed she couldn't quite control. She was likely born in the mid-12th century, a daughter of a Swedish noble house, possibly linked to the Stenkil dynasty, which had long vied for influence in the tangled web of Scandinavian succession. Her marriage to Magnus the Strong, a Danish prince with ambitions to rule, placed her at the heart of Denmark's brutal and often bloody power struggles. It was a time of shifting borders, rival kings, and short lifespans. Thrones were held by the sword, not by ceremony. Christina, as the story goes, was no mere decorative wife. She was said to be sharp, politically aware, and unafraid to speak her mind. A trifecta that almost guaranteed slander in the chronicles written by cloistered monks with a talent for moral suspicion. But it wasn't her opinions that landed her in trouble with posterity. It was her alleged behavior after her husband's death. When Magnus died, likely in battle or some violent royal intrigue, Christina did not retire to a nunnery, as custom and church pressure would have preferred. Nor did she live out her days in pious widowhood. According to 13th and 14th century Danish and Icelandic sagas, Christina did something far worse. She lived as a woman alone, with power and property, and without a husband to answer to. That alone would have been enough to inspire contempt in the male-dominated narrative machine of the medieval world. But Christina's legend grew darker. Ballads described her as unruly, vain, and promiscuous. One tale claimed she seduced her household knights. Another said she wore men's clothing to disguise her escapades. A few accused her of dabbling in sorcery, which, in the logic of medieval gossip, was indistinguishable from having too many opinions. Were any of these stories true? Likely not. More likely, Christina was a political inconvenience, a woman who didn't vanish when her husband's name did, and whose independence became threatening in an era that couldn't imagine a woman wielding agency without consequence. So they gave her a punishment history often reserved for women like her. They rewrote her as a warning. But even those medieval chroniclers couldn't fully smother her allure. The stories stuck. Not because she ruled with an iron hand or left behind great architectural feats, but because she defied the script. Christina refused to be tamed by grief, by status, or by expectation. She haunted the edge of power, and because they couldn't bury her, they mythologized her. And in a way, Christina's legend reveals as much about her as it does about the world that remembered her, a world in which a queen without a king had to be explained, a world that translated autonomy into vice and complexity into sin. She may have vanished from the throne, but she never really disappeared. And so our journey ends, not with a woman confirmed by record books or immortalized in oil paintings, but with a spectre, half memory, half mirror, reminding us that the history of royal women is rarely written in fact. It's written in fear, in fascination, and in the spaces where power and pleasure collide.